Fine. Yes, harm reduction with tobacco and nicotine is, to say the least, very controversial. All of us that have been working in this area know about that. With most other products and areas, we accept harm reduction as something very natural. For example, with car safety, materials to protect from fires, food, and the list could be made very long. Those who are against harm reduction are not just against tobacco and maybe also as common tobacco industry, but more recently they are also starting to be against nicotine. And I believe that those against harm reduction with tobacco and nicotine accepts the alcohol regulation that actually relies on its potential harm. So products are graded to a degree of harmfulness. The ultimate battleground here is on whether it's possible to eradicate nicotine from human use. There are, however, many examples to learn from there are not, I should say, not very many examples to learn from when it comes to completely stopping and even illegal drug use. And the thing is also whether we can eradicate nicotine without other negative consequences. In the US, nicotine has been hit hard and been denormalized, while at the same time cannabis have flourished and been legalized. So I will now show some examples of harm reduction in operation. Next slide, please, if someone is advancing the slides for me. Yes. Tobacco is actually an ideal area for harm reduction. And that is first because tobacco is largely used because of nicotine, and pure nicotine and even unburned tobacco is not a big part of the problem, the health consequences. We know this quite well in Sweden. Okay. And I will now do some snapshots from 4 countries where harm reduction is in practice with different kind of products. First, Sweden and Norway, where we have snus as the harm reduction product, and Swedish snus has actually also been regarded by FDA as a modified risk tobacco product. So it has an advantage. It's not as harmful as other tobacco products. Japan, they are using heat but not burn products. And in the United Kingdom, it's largely electronic cigarettes. So next slide, Sweden. If we look at the prevalence of smoking and snus use in Sweden, we see that 7% of men and women are smokers daily. But when we go to snus, as many as 18% of the men are using snus, and 4% of the women are using snus. Among women, it's gradually increasing, but it has been lower than 4%. So there is really a difference between the sexes here, which we will come to in a second. Overall, in the total line, you see that there is more snus used than smoking. Okay, here we come to what is my most important slide for today. And we are talking about death rates here attributable to tobacco. The figures are a little bit old. They are from 2004. WHO compiled this data. But I can tell you that if you are looking at the global burden of diseases, the data will be quite similar to what we have here. So first, we have the European Union countries. We have the median. For all the countries, we have the maximum and we have the minimum. So if we start to look at men, lung cancer, we see that the medium is 220 persons out of 100,000 that dies from that in the European Union. Some country, the highest country is actually up in 399. Where is Sweden? Sweden has 87, which is, and here we have the second lowest country with 91. So Sweden is the lowest on lung cancer. Other cancers, again, Sweden is lower than the second lowest and much lower than the average or the mean. And if we go to all cardiovascular, we see the same, 72 people out of 100,000 rather than the average 170. And this is despite that the Swedish men are using about as much as nicotine as in most other countries in the European Union. So if it was the nicotine in the smokeless tobacco that caused cardiovascular disease, why would Sweden be the lowest of all countries? All causes, of course, the same. We are much lower than the average and also much lower than the second lowest. So that was the men. If we then go down and look at women, and the Swedish rate for lung cancer 61, that's actually higher than the average. 17 is actually higher than the EU average. So is cardiovascular 63. So there is an experiment here. It's not that Swedes are different because why would we then see the difference between men and women? This is depending on whether you are using the harm reduction product or not. So, okay, thank you. Next slide, please. It can be shown in another way. This is data from also from World Health Organization compiling all the EU countries where we see Poland is in the top and Sweden is in the bottom when it comes to mortality attributed to tobacco. Okay, then we switch to Norway. Next slide, please. And here we see prevalence of tobacco use in females and in males. And we see an interesting communicating your thing here. As snus was starting to increase among females, smoking decreased. The same we can see among the males as smoking started to decrease, or the other way around, as snus started to increase, the smoking started to decrease. So it seems to be that if, like a communicating yard here, if we go to the next one, next slide, please. We have a fascinating figure, namely if we look at this special population of young women and we look at smokers, it used to be 15%, but have been declining all the way to 1%. How come? Yeah, again, what is happening at the same time is that snus use is going up. This cannot with 100% certainly be said to be a causal effect, but they do coincide very well, and it's hard to not think that there is some causality involved here. Okay, next slide, please. Then we go to Japan. And Japan, in the Japanese market, there has been these heat but not burn products that have been the reason for some decline in smoking. What we should be aware of is that the tobacco sales, and particularly cigarette sales, are usually extremely stable from one year to another. It's a money machine, as Dr. Sweenor, the previous speaker, talked about. But in 2016 around, these heat but not burn products were introduced, and we see then that cigarette sales started to decline. And if we look at the table here below, and if we set the sales at 2016, to 100. In 2019, they were down to 66.7. So there is a more than 30% reduction in cigarette sales and production, which is probably, at least to a large degree, because of the entrance of this product on the Japanese market. And it also deserves to be mentioned that these products, the market have been the mechanism. They have not needed subsistence from the state and any money from the public health resources. So then we are in the United Kingdom, and here it's the electronic cigarette that seemed to have been an interesting and used product for various means. On this picture, we can see that the prevalence of smoking was going down since 1990s steadily. But what we have heard is that the e-cigarette can actually be a gateway to cigarette, and people are less interested in stopping. That does not seem to be the case here. The decline in prevalence continues, but if anything, after the electronic cigarettes were introduced, has accelerated. So it seemed to have been doing something good in the United Kingdom. And in the next slide, we can see what are smokers using when they want to give up. So they have been used, what aid they used during the last quit attempt. And the green line is electronic cigarettes. And we see how they have made the entrance and become the most popular tool to help smokers come off the cigarettes. Here there is unfortunately a dip, which I think is due to the very intense negative publications and PR around e-cigarettes as causing a severe lung disease, which of course turned out not to be the case. Here we have nicotine replacement and nicotine replacement prescription and behavioral procedures. But e-cigarettes is the most popular product to stop smoking when smokers are doing it themselves. Next slide, please. So what I want to show you here is that we can have two continua. One, similarity to cigarettes on the y-axis, and we have degree of harmfulness on the x-axis. Then, of course, the cigarette is very high in harmfulness, actually the most harmful of the tobacco products as far as we know. This should be the heat but not burned cigarettes. They are less in harm. We don't know how much. We do know that the exposure, if you are using these products, is just a fraction of if you are smoking. So most likely they need to be less harmful. But they are relatively similar to the behavior that goes with cigarette smoking. If we go to the next slide, we can see the electronic cigarette, or one of them, which is, again, we think, definitely less harmful than the cigarettes, but again, relatively similar in terms of the behavior needed, but a little less than the heat but not burn, I think. They are the most close to cigarettes. Here you find the snus, which we know has very low harmfulness, basically from the Swedish epidemiology, but there are some studies in US and other countries also. That is, however, very far from cigarettes in terms of use behaviors. And next slide here. Yes, thank you. So a little bit to the right of the snus, we now also have this non-tobacco oral nicotine products. that are actually very, very close to pharmaceutical NRT. For example, in the Nordic countries, we have a pouch like this, which has a medical license. It's called Sonic, 2 and 4 milligram. And usually these bind nicotine to microcrystalline cellulose. Then there are some other constituents. But these products, Syn, On, Lift, are very, very similar to the nicotine replacement products. So also in terms of safety, they ought to be relatively similar. The best way for a smoker would, of course, to stop smoking and maybe stop using any nicotine and tobacco at all. But many find that too difficult and want to have a more stepwise journey out of the cigarette. And then the easiest way would be, I think, using heat not burn as a stepping stone, then on to e-cigarettes, and if needed, going to the pouches with tobacco or without tobacco. So that is an option that is probably taking a little longer than it can make a switch directly from cigarettes to smokeless tobacco products. Okay, my final slide, which is the summary, is that I think the reduction in harm is already happening in Sweden and is well supported by Swedish studies and has also been accepted as the first reduced harm product by the Federal Food and Drug Agency in the United States. Smokers now more than ever have the option to choose product according to their need when they are going out of smoking. The final battle for harm reduction, I think, is not so much on how safe the harm reduction products will be, because these new non-tobacco oral nicotine pouches, they are probably very close to the safety of nicotine replacement. The final battle is whether we can eradicate nicotine or if nicotine will be accepted as a cultural drug. Thank you very much.